A woman who ignores what her body's telling her is just digging her grave with a soup spoon. That's what Robert used to say. Dr. Wilson's gloved hands froze mid-motion. The entire operating room fell silent. "What in God's name?" he whispered, his 30 years of surgical experience offering no explanation for what lay beneath Helen Carter's weathered skin. The neck mass, presumed to be a simple lipoma, had finally been exposed after 71-year-old Helen reluctantly agreed to surgery. For 18 years, she'd hidden it beneath carefully arranged scarves and upturned collars. "Someone get Dr. Blackwood in here now," Dr. Wilson ordered, voice steady despite his widened eyes. Within the growth, something metallic caught the harsh operating room lights. Something impossible. Something that would change everything. Spring 1997. The lump had appeared without fanfare. A small, painless bump just below Helen Carter's hairline. She discovered it while brushing her hair one morning, 9 months after burying Robert. Just another unwelcome change in a life that had already changed too much. "Probably nothing," she muttered to her reflection, the bathroom still cluttered with Robert's things she couldn't bear to move. His reading glasses, his aftershave, his voice in her head saying, "Get that check, Helen." She ignored it, just as she'd ignored the nightmares that appeared after her deployment in '91. Just as she'd ignored Robert's pleas to see a specialist when a headache started. Women in the Carter family didn't run to doctors for every little thing. Her mother had taught her that much before the old woman's heart gave out at her sewing machine. Helen's nursing career was thriving that year, her promotion to head nurse at Ridgemont Medical Center giving her purpose, structure, reasons to keep moving when grief threatened to cement her feet to the floor. "You coming to the staff meeting?" Linda Morrison had called to ask that morning. "Be there in 30, Helen replied, adjusting her collar to hide the bump, a habit that would persist for decades. That evening, as Helen sat alone on her back porch, tea in hand, the spring thunderstorm rolling in reminded her of desert storms. The distant thunder transported her back. Helicopter rotors, distant explosions, the weight of Jennifer Walsh in her arms. The metallic smell of blood mixed with sand and fear. The memory came, so suddenly she dropped her cup. Hot liquid spattering across the deck Robert had built himself the previous summer. "Get it together, Carter," she growled, pressing her palm against the lump. It felt warm, almost alive. Robert would have insisted she see someone, would have made the appointment himself, and driven her there if necessary. But Robert was gone, his absence a larger lump in her throat than any physical ailment could ever be. "A woman carries her burdens alone," her mother used to say. So Helen did what Carter women had always done. She straightened her shoulders, cleaned up the broken cup, and decided to carry this burden too. The next day, she bought higher collar blouses. The day after that, she turned down an invitation to her daughter's pool party. By month's end, she'd added scarves to her wardrobe despite the Georgia heat. The lump would remain her secret, a physical manifestation of all she couldn't express. What harm could come from ignoring one small bump in a life already marked by deeper wounds? Robert would have known better. Robert always did. 2015, the intervention. "What inspired you to pursue medicine, Miss Carter?" Sophie Carter sat perfectly straight in the leather chair across from 3 Johns Hopkins Medical School admissions officers. At 18, she was younger than most applicants, but her academic credentials had earned her this early interview. "My grandmother," she answered without hesitation. "For as long as I can remember, she's had this growth on the back of her neck. It started small, but now," she measured with her hands, demonstrating something the size of a small orange. "She refuses to see a doctor. Watching her suffer in silence made me realize how many people endure pain rather than seek help. I want to be the kind of doctor who bridges that gap." The admissions panel nodded appreciatively, unaware that 40 miles away, the subject of her inspiration sat alone in her dimly lit living room, adjusting her scarf despite the July heat. Helen Carter had grown accustomed to the weight and presence of her companion. The lump, though she never called it that, had become part of her identity over the past 18 years. Once the size of a marble, it now resembled a small orange. Her daughter Michelle had stopped mentioning it years ago after dozens of rejected pleas. Her grandson, David avoided looking at that side of her face altogether. Only Sophie, stubborn like her grandmother, continued to broach the subject during Sunday dinners. "It's getting worse, Grandma," she'd say, medical textbooks piled beside her plate. "I can tell by how you're holding your head." Helen would only grunt in response, steering conversation elsewhere. Anything but the unwelcome hitchhiker that had taken residence between her shoulder blades. But this Sunday was different. "I'm not coming for dinner unless you agree to see a doctor," Sophie's voice declared firmly through the telephone receiver. "This isn't negotiable anymore, Grandma." Helen's weathered hand tightened around the phone. "Since when does the child dictate terms to the elder?" "Since the elder started sleeping in a recliner because she can't lie flat without pain," Sophie countered. "Mom told me, so don't bother denying it." Michelle, standing in Helen's kitchen doorway with arms crossed, nodded in solidarity. The Carter women had formed an alliance. "It's just old age," Helen insisted, the excuse worn thin from overuse. "Then you won't mind having a doctor confirm that," Michelle said, stepping forward. "Sophie, your grandmother will see Dr. Wilson next Tuesday at 2 p.m. I've already made the appointment." Helen's protest died on her lips as she caught sight of her daughter's expression. The same determined look Robert had worn when he decided something was non-negotiable. "Fine," she conceded, the single syllable nearly choking her. "But I'm going alone." "Like hell you are," Michelle replied. The discovery. Tuesday arrived with oppressive humidity and thunderclouds that matched Helen's mood. Michelle appeared at her door at 1 p.m. sharp, car keys dangling from determined fingers. The waiting room at Ridgemont Medical Center smelled of antiseptic and artificial lavender. Sophie was already there, sitting with a medical journal. She looked up when they entered, relief visible. "You came," she said simply, embracing her grandmother. Dr. Thomas Wilson was warm and understanding, with silver hair and hands marked by age spots similar to Helen's own. "Miss Carter," he said, extending his hand. "I understand this visit has been some time in the making." Helen grunted noncommittally. "My mother was the same way," Dr. Wilson continued. "Served as an army nurse. Wouldn't see a doctor if her arm was falling off." Something in his tone loosened the knot in Helen's chest. "Gulf War," she offered gruffly. "Desert Storm." Dr. Wilson nodded. "My mother passed from cancer that could have been treated if she'd come in sooner. That's why I became a doctor." The examination was thorough but respectful. When a moment came to remove the scarf, Helen hesitated. "Take your time," Dr. Wilson said quietly. With trembling fingers, Helen unwound the scarf. The silence in the examination room was deafening as the mass was fully revealed. Dr. Wilson maintained his composure, but Helen caught the brief widening of his eyes. "How long has this been growing?" "Started small, 97 or thereabouts." "And the pain?" Helen shrugged. "Manageable." "Mom," Michelle interjected. "Tell him the truth." "Can't sleep flat anymore," Helen admitted reluctantly. "Gets hot sometimes. Throbs with the weather." Dr. Wilson's examination was gentle but thorough. "I'm concerned about several aspects of this growth. I'd like to schedule an MRI and then surgery to remove it soon." "Surgery?" Helen's mouth went dry. Given its location near the spine and its size, removal is the prudent course. It's most likely benign, but we should address it before it causes neurological complications. Sophie leaned forward. "What's the timeline?" "I'd like to do the MRI tomorrow and surgery by the end of the week." Before Helen fully processed what was happening, she had an MRI appointment for the following morning and surgery scheduled for Friday. The night before surgery stretched before Helen like an endless road. Sleep had abandoned her entirely. The digital clock glowed 2:17 a.m. "You're being ridiculous, old woman," she muttered, shifting uncomfortably in the recliner. Helen reached for the lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing the writing desk in the corner. Robert's desk, where he'd written letters, paid bills, composed Christmas cards. She hadn't touched it since his passing. Tonight it called to her. Helen eased herself from the recliner and made her way to the desk. The drawers still contained Robert's stationery. His fingers trembled slightly as she extracted a sheet and reached for a pen. "Dear Sophie and David." She paused, What did one write in such a letter? If you're reading this, it means I'm gone or too stubborn to tell you these things to your faces. Probably the latter. There are things a woman carries that aren't visible, things heavier than any growth on the neck. I've carried such things since before you were born. Desert Storm wasn't just a war I fought in. It was a place that changed me in ways I've never explained to anyone, not even your grandfather. The pen moved more quickly now. There was a woman named Jennifer Walsh. We called her Jen. Best field medic in our unit. Could stabilize a critical patient in impossible conditions. Always had a smile, even when we were covered in sand with scorpions in our boots. Had a husband back home named Marcus who sent her letters that she'd read aloud, sharing those small pieces of normalcy. Helen's hand began to shake, forcing her to set down the pen. The memories flooded back with overwhelming clarity. It was near the Iraqi border. Sandstorm so thick you couldn't see 3 feet ahead. We were trying to evacuate wounded when the shelling started. Jen and I were separated from our unit. There was an explosion. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. The weight of her as I carried her through the sand. The blood that wouldn't stop. Her voice growing weaker, telling me to leave her to save myself. I didn't leave her. I couldn't. But I couldn't save her either. Helen's throat constricted with emotion she'd refused to acknowledge for over 20 years. They told me later she died before we reached the medical unit. I received a commendation for bringing her body back through enemy territory. They call me a hero. I'm not a hero. Heroes save people. I just carried a dead woman through a desert. I never told your grandfather the full story. He knew I had nightmares, but I spared him the details. Maybe that was wrong. When the lump first appeared, years after Robert passed, I convinced myself it was a punishment. Foolish, I know. I don't know why I'm telling you this now, but I want you to know, don't make my mistake. Don't carry burdens alone until they become too heavy to bear. I'm proud of you both. Sophie, with your determination to heal others. David, with your compassion for those struggling. You are the best parts of your grandfather and the person I might have been without the war. Love, Grandma. Helen set down the pen and stared at the letter. The confession felt both liberating and terrifying. Mom, Helen startled, turning to find Michelle standing in the doorway. What are you doing up? Michelle asked gently, crossing the room. Couldn't sleep, Helen replied. Michelle's eyes scanned the letter. Mom, why haven't you ever talked about this? Women of my generation didn't talk about such things, Helen said automatically. Did you? Michelle asked softly. Move on. The question hung in the air. I thought I had, Helen finally said, until Robert got sick. Then everything unraveled. Michelle reached for her hand. Dad would have wanted you to talk about it, to get help. Your father wanted a lot of things I couldn't give him. He wanted you to be happy, Mom. That's all he ever wanted. Helen looked at her daughter and saw Robert in the determined set of her jaw. I've disappointed you. No, Michelle said firmly. You've worried me. There's a difference. They sat in companionable silence until sleep finally began to claim Helen. Morning arrived with pale sunlight. Helen opened her eyes to find David sitting across from her, the letter open in his hands. Morning, Grandma, he said. Mom thought we should read this before the surgery. And Helen couldn't bring herself to ask the real question. David carefully refolded the letter. My counselor at the VA says the strongest veterans are the ones who acknowledge their wounds. Before Helen could respond, Sophie appeared. Time ago, Grandma. Today's the day you finally get rid of your unwanted companion. As they made their way to the car, Helen felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Whatever happened in the operating room, she had already begun a different kind of surgery, the excision of secrets too long carried alone. The surgery. The operating room hummed with quiet efficiency. Monitors beeped steadily as Dr. Wilson worked with methodical precision. Tissue appears consistent with lipoma, he commented. Capsule is well-defined. For 20 minutes, the surgery progressed as expected. Then Dr. Wilson's hand suddenly froze. There's something, his voice trailed off. Hand me the finer forceps, please. The atmosphere shifted as Dr. Wilson delicately probed deeper. There's a foreign object embedded in the capsule. Metallic. The team exchanged glances. Looks like it's been there for decades, Dr. Wilson continued. The body has completely encapsulated it. As he extracted the item, the operating room fell silent. Are those? The nurse began. Dog tags, Dr. Wilson confirmed. Military dog tags. How is that possible? This isn't just a lipoma, Dr. Wilson said. The body has created a protective capsule around the tags. He carefully placed the tags in a specimen dish. Can you make out the name? Dr. Blackwood leaned closer. Walsh, Jennifer M., blood type A positive. She looked up. These aren't Ms. Carter's tags. No, Dr. Wilson agreed. And there might be more. A second metallic object emerged, a fragment of shrapnel, approximately the size of a dime. I need to complete the removal, Dr. Wilson said. But I want this entire specimen sent to pathology intact. This is unprecedented. 90 minutes later, Dr. Wilson placed the final suture. I've been a surgeon for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The revelation. Helen woke in recovery. Dr. Wilson sitting beside her bed with the specimen container. It's done. Helen's voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. The surgery went well. Dr. Wilson paused. Ms. Carter, we found something unexpected. He reached for the container. We found these. Helen's eyes struggled to focus. When recognition dawned, color drained from her face. That's not possible, she whispered. These dog tags were embedded deep within the tissue. They've been there for many years. Helen's hand trembled as she reached for the container. Jennifer Walsh, she read, her voice breaking. You know her. Helen closed her eyes. She died in my arms in Desert Storm. I tried to save her, but couldn't. Ms. Carter, Dr. Wilson said gently, from a medical perspective, what we found is extraordinary. Your body created a specialized capsule around these objects, preserving them. Helen hardly registered his words, focused on the tags. I thought they were buried with her, she murmured. Michelle entered, taking in the scene. Mom. Helen looked at her daughter. It's Jen's tags, the soldier I mentioned in my letter. I've been carrying her with me all this time, and I didn't even know it. 1 year later, 1 year after the surgery, Helen stood before Robert's grave in the small cemetery. Autumn air carried a crisp edge through the Georgia pines. You were right, old man, Helen said softly, placing flowers against the headstone. You usually were. The past year had unfolded in unexpected ways. Through the VA, Sophie had tracked down Jennifer's family. Her husband, Marcus, now remarried but still honoring Jennifer's memory, had been overwhelmed to receive the tags. She saved 6 people that day before the shelling started. Marcus had told Helen during their emotional meeting. The explosion that took her happened while she was treating wounded soldiers. You were one of them, Helen. You don't remember because of the head trauma, but according to the after-action reports, Jennifer was working on your injuries when the second blast hit. The revelation had shattered Helen's decades-old narrative. She hadn't failed to save Jennifer. Jennifer had been saving her. The tags must have fallen during the explosion, Marcus explained. In the chaos, with both of you covered in blood and sand, they became embedded in your wound. Your body preserved them all these years. Helen now volunteered at the VA, co-facilitating a support group with other Desert Storm veterans. The wound that had festered for decades was finally healing, not through forgetting, but through understanding and connection. Sophie had started medical school, specializing in trauma response and foreign body preservation. David worked as a veterans counselor, helping others navigate the invisible wounds of service. You should see the family now, Helen told Robert's headstone. Michelle's thriving. The grandkids are doing amazing work. The house is full of life again. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers. Helen smiled, seeing it as Robert's response. Jennifer's family is coming for Thanksgiving. Marcus and his wife, her 2 sisters. The house hasn't been this full since you were running things. I think you'd approve. Helen had found Jennifer's letters to Marcus, preserved by her family. One, written weeks before her death, mentioned a nurse named Helen who reminds me why we're here, to help people heal. The letter now held a place of honor in Helen's home, alongside her own military commendations and the dog tags, returned to her by Marcus's family as a gift. Thank you, Helen whispered to the sky, to Robert, to Jennifer, to whatever forces had conspired to bring her to this moment of peace. For not giving up on me. From inside her car came Sophie's voice calling her. Time to head to the Veterans Center for their weekly meeting. Helen Carter walked toward her granddaughter, no longer hiding behind scarves or silence. The scar on her neck was visible, a badge of honor rather than shame. Her eyes met the world with hard-won wisdom, someone who had journeyed through darkness and emerged into light. The weight she'd carried for over 20 years had been transformed. Not simply removed, but understood, honored, and finally released. As she drove away from the cemetery, Helen felt Robert's presence and Jennifer's memory not as burdens, but as part of her story, one of survival, healing, and the courage to finally set down what she'd carried alone for far too long. Some burdens transform us by their weight. Others transform us when we find the courage to set them down. Helen Carter had learned both lessons, and in learning them, she had finally found peace. Have you been carrying burdens that were never yours to bear? Helen Carter spent over 20 years believing she'd failed her best friend, hiding both physical and emotional scars beneath carefully arranged scarves and silence. It took a medical crisis and her granddaughter's persistence to reveal the truth, that sometimes our deepest wounds contain unexpected healing. Share your thoughts in the comments. What burden might you be ready to set down?